Well, thank you. I'll speed up the I'll speed read. So let's start, and we're gonna change a bit the pace and the topic. So my name is Judith van der Elst. I'm an archaeologist by training. Lived and studied and worked in New Mexico for about 15 years. After an academic fruitful hiatus, I'm again employed as researcher, now at the University of Applied Sciences in Groningen, where I focus on the value of artistic research and currently also involved as a researcher with the Elst Northern Netherlands project that is focused on the responsible implementation of AI in healthcare. So my presentation of today is inspired by my work in New Mexico, but incorporates my diverging embedded and embodied research exploration since then. So the focus is more on practical and methodological applications of biosemiosis. So in this presentation, I explore the need for land-based knowledge systems in sustainability efforts through the correlation between loss of language and loss of biodiversity. The possible reasons for this co-occurrence were investigated and published in 2012 by Gorenflo et al. And although some form of functional connection is suggested, it proves complex and variable across regions. But based on these findings, in this presentation, I further explore this link from different angles in the context of the current phenomena of diminishing diversity in its possible relation to the growing global problem of toxic waste. I furthermore discuss that current efforts of language revitalization are necessary to address the problem of expanding wastelands, and will do so by means of a case study from New Mexico, USA, from a biosemiotic perspective. In the case of New Mexico, the reduced access to land and the impact of boarding school programs are major factors in loss of language. And in today's presentation, I will connect pre-colonial past that I studied as part of my dissertation and research many years ago, and the nuclear present, in which different politics of which also became intertwined in my life and research. So waste, even though referring to physical remains, object, or flow, is also a concept or abstraction that is defined in several ways in different languages. In general, waste refers to unwanted or unusable materials, but as it is in the eye of the beholder, waste for one can mean a resource for another person or organism. Waste within a system only becomes a problem when decay takes much longer than the needed regeneration to sustain the system as a whole. Waste in modern societal context refers to waste as a problem for system sustainability and defined in mostly economic terms. For instance, within the United Nations Statistics Division, waste is described as materials that are not prime products, that is, products produced for the market, for which the generator has no further use in terms of his or her purposes of production, transformation, or consumption, and wants to dispose of. Wasteland, the topic of this talk, are geographic areas that are rapidly growing in size, referred to by Sterling as obsolete objects, areas that have become so toxic because of human means of production that they are no longer fit for human habitation. Yet these areas were, are, and remain often the home of marginalized populations and turn into or current to a mostly hidden waste problem. So according to Offenhuber, waste is material information, and yet the systems and infrastructures that process our waste often remain opaque. The challenge we are facing then is how can we make these waste streams and human and environmental health effects legible and knowable? How do we incorporate waste in our meaning-making systems? So if maintaining biodiversity is paramount for the survival of our and other species in our shared ecosystem, local knowledge that captures diversity and changes in the landscape within different languages can be an important contribution to the scientific methods we currently have at our disposal. The question is whether the knowledge captured in the languages can be saved in repositories without further supporting its speakers, or is it necessary to support the people and their cultural complexes in which these languages developed? Through the case study, I argue for the latter, as I consider languages and multimodal meaning-making complexes as dynamic entities evolving within specific worldviews. So the state of New Mexico is archaeologically known as part of the greater Southwest region with a long and rich cultural development that interconnected this region far beyond its current borders. Sites such as Bandelier, Chaco Canyon, and Paquimé are incredible sites and systems where I worked. For the sake of the argument, the focus here will be on a geographically small but culturally very rich region that is currently well known because of its nuclear heritage. Due to colonial efforts and subsequent developments, the region became part of the first Mexican Empire in 1821 and became part of the United States as the 47th state in 1912. Traditional land rights that were negotiated as part of these transformations are based on a history of tribal sovereignty and connected to traditional lands. Despite these rights, many indigenous communities have faced challenges related to historical land dispossession, ongoing conflicts with external development projects, and struggles to have their traditional land rights fully recognized by the state. Most notably, as was earlier mentioned this week by Mickey, boarding school programs were intended, what Yogi has introduced in the beginning of this week, as semiocide. Beginning soon after New Mexico became a US state, assimilation policies more broadly were implemented to eradicate indigenous cultures. As a largely desert landscape with unique ecosystems, it turned out to be also very rich in minerals, oil, gas, and especially uranium. It's the latter that has made New Mexico a pivotal player in world history. However, the majority of the people of New Mexico have not benefited from that. On the contrary, most of its population suffers up until today from detrimental effect of nuclear weapons and energy developments. So even though assimilation policies and programs were only partially successful, it supported the idea that this land was empty. The opening scene of the movie Oppenheimer shows it as such, in which the land rights and sovereignty became a collateral for involving local populations and especially tribal members to work in the uranium mines. The Manhattan Project at Los Alamos National Laboratory, which is located on ancestral Tewa lands, needed a local source for its nuclear development. Navajo land turned out to be a prime area. The choice, especially for the Navajo tribe, was to either work in the mine to gain economic dependence or resist and lose all their rights. A double bind, if you ask me. The subsequent history and detrimental consequences for human and environmental health have long been known, but not shared with tribes or public. Even though the local population, the people who have worked in the mines, the downwinders of the nuclear test sites have been documented their personal and environmental health problems. The scope of these detrimental effects are only recently becoming more explicit because downwind, downstream, and delayed consequences, such as polluted soils and waterways, are hard to measure and retrace to its source. So yet in 1981, the US Department of Energy realized it had a major nuclear waste problem. The waste had been accumulated for the better part of 40 years and was likely to remain deadly to humans for at least 10,000 years. In the past, such waste had been dumped into the sea at more than 50 sites in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. But international treaties and the potential environmental impact meant that this was no longer an option. The only option was to bury it, which led to a big question: how to inform future generations? So the Department of Energy assembled a dream team of communication experts, archaeologists, social scientists, and long-term climatologists to crack the problem. They were called the Human Interference Task Force, and their work would spawn ideas ranging from elaborate monoliths and buried vaults to glow-in-the-dark cats and invented religions. Sending messages into the future isn't as straightforward as it may seem. Thomas Zebiok, who was part of the Human Interference Task Force to address this problem, wrote a technical report, Communication Measures to Bridge 10 Millennia in 1984. And this report is a semiotic analysis of the problem, examining it in terms of the science or theory of messages and symbols. Because of the long period of time involved, the report recommends that a relay system of recoding messages be initiated, that the messages contain a mixture of iconic, indexical, and symbolic elements, and that a high degree of redundancy of messages be employed. Outlandish ideas to create such messaging system ensued, but none were ever acted upon. And in 1993, the Sandia National Laboratories put together its own report, focused on preventing intruders from reaching the waste isolation pilot plant, which is a deep geological facility for storing nuclear waste. It's stored more than 2,000 feet below ground in the salt formation. So around the same time, NASA shifted focus to include its Earth observing system, sensors and platforms that were orbiting Earth to monitor changes on our planet from space. Many different sensors and platforms have since been in operation, each collecting data, specific parts of the electromagnetic spectrum at different scales and resolutions. That has given us new perspectives, yet local stories are still ignored. There are two main waste streams associated with uranium, transuranic waste, and that is stored underground in facilities for which Sebiok was asked to create signs, and waste that is embanked at tailing dams. It's typically an earth-filled dam to store byproducts of mining. They're usually highly toxic and potentially radioactive. Tailing dams rank among the largest engineered structures on Earth. The World Mine Tailings Failures Report estimates that are between 29,000 and 35,000 of these facilities are in use. A quarter of these are abandoned or unmonitored. And on July 16, 1997, the Church Rock uranium spill on our nation released more than 1,100 tons of solid radioactive mineral waste and 94 million gallons of acidic radioactive tailings solution in the Rio Puerco, the biggest spill in US history that little people know about. So the landscape transforms, takes on new meaning, overlaid on a very rich land-based relationship and history, which will now go to the past, and how land-based knowledge was removed from this whole equation, a prelude to the other side of the story. So in my archaeological research that I conducted in the early 2000s, I was interested if I could employ emergent spatial technologies in which I had specialized, such as geographic information systems and remote sensing, to represent indigenous ways of thinking and meaning making, underpinning the material records, as this is usually only partly explained by functional optimization models. My advisor at that time, Dr. Beverly Singer, who's an ethnologist and filmmaker, and it's also Tewa and Dine, this was our first challenge. I was required to appoint a second committee chair, as Dr. Singer was not considered objective as advisor. So I used remote sensing and image processing, and it opened for me new ways to understand space and create categories of space I had never before imagined. So based on different data sets that needed to be pre-processed, to be compatible, interoperable, machine learning and multivariate statistics could be used to generate new landscape categories, such as based on the spectral signatures of different materials. Plants not only recognized by their form, but their temporal patterns of reflecting light. Other examples, I can go on and on and on. I don't want to do this, so but sake of this time, I will move on. So I based my thesis that indigenous thinking might be very different from Western perspective on a program on spatial cognition at the University of Nijmegen. Their research describes unexpected findings concerning variation in spatial language across cultures and places them in a context of general anthropologies of space on the one hand, and theories of spatial cognitions in the cognitive science on the other. There has been much concern with the symbolism of space in anthropological writings, but little on concepts of space in practical activities, Levinson states. Notable differences are the use of the until then unknown absolute framework of reference in different spatial ontologies. This unexpected cultural variation raises interesting questions concerning the relation between cultural and linguistic concepts and the biological foundations of cognition. It argues for more sophisticated models relating culture and cognition than we currently have available. For information regarding the Tewa concept of space, I consulted different but two main sources. the ethnogeography of the Tewa Indians, an in-depth study of ideas, concept, terminology, and place names recorded by ethnologist Harrington during the early 20th century. Use of this study remains controversial for the indigenous population, and this was recorded based on the expectation that people would disappear or assimilate. The second major source, Alfonso Ortiz's The World, the Tewa World, Space, Time, and Being and Becoming in a Pueblo Society, published in 1969, while sharing this of sacred practices with outsider, generated some controversy within his community. Ortiz was an early proponent of autoethnography and encouraged other native peoples to produce scholarship on their own cultures instead of being the object of study of outside researchers. The place names listed all the tribes that had a name for a particular place, and I coded these in a raster data layers to be overlaid on other landscape data. I could then query and gain insight in how different groups would navigate the land and relate to each other. The framework described by Ortiz then helped me to shape the world as a watershed, as a bowl bounded by sacred mountains, a world spiritual as well as pragmatic to observe and gain knowledge, navigate and negotiate relationships. There were also names that were difficult to map, more ephemeral qualities such as sound, shadows, and winds. For instance, winds were allowed through the villages, through open corners, and as these winds would carry spirits of the ancestors, the land's surface then just becomes a conduit for carrying these messages. At that time, I learned about the work and later worked with Alma Farina and Biosemiotics that helped me understand this atmospheric space and the whole world differently. Frequency spaces that are material, but in a very different dimension. For me, then, the geospatial scientific approach merged with the world of meaning in a very sensible way through what seems many indexical relationships. I imagined this being part of me being part of a Persian constellation. The framework that was so outlined was connected through flows and relationships. Something happened then. So even though the intention of my work was to investigate if indigenous knowledge systems are equally valuable as Western scientific-based knowledge of embodied knowledge, there was some backlash that has forced me to rethink whether we can be neutral in our endeavors and question if meaning-making is always contentious and political. Both I and Dr. Singer were accused by another committee member that this research was a means to support tribal land claims and could not be credited as scholarly endeavor toward my doctorate degree. We solved the issue and moved on. And this was happening around the same time that there was a lot of controversy around the recognition of one of the sacred mountains, Mount Taylor, an abandoned mining area. It was recognized as traditional cultural property with deep historic and sacred importance to at least 30 Native American tribes. The designation protects its cultural and environmental integrity from threats like ongoing mining. But it does not give the tribe any kind of veto right, only that they are consulted in the decision-making process, but it spurred sometimes a violent backlash from the corporate interest. Today, Mount Taylor, which is public land, is again aggressively pursued for opening new mining pits. So in 2020, on the cusp of the COVID pandemic, I was invited by Dr. Singer to participate in a language revitalization project of the Kapa Owinge of Santa Clara Pueblo Elementary School. Unfortunately, the project was halted because of the pandemic, but nonetheless, a few months I participated were very inspiring. So a few takeaway points. The students would speak their language, especially in the art and movement classes. It was then that I became more aware of the indigenous art community and novel ways to express their relationship to the land that was changing. What local populations have long known and experienced bodily here is that these means of resource exploitation in which waste is ignored are extremely dangerous and harmful for human and other life forms. They have documented and shared what happened in their surroundings. So only now the world seems to catch up. It turns out, based on now publicly available data from Los Alamos, that waste was released in the local environment in the early days and that radiation levels are extremely high in the now measured places. So other novel methods that we can use are developed to trace these polluting elements back to its source. Still, another way to support indigenous communities, scholars, and artists is in their efforts to raise awareness of what is happening in these lands that affect us all through the way we are related through air and water. So this landmark volume is the gathering of native North American contemporary artists, musicians, filmmakers, and so on. It's conceived by Jeffrey Gibson, a renowned artist in Mississippi Choctaw and Cherokee descent. And Indigenous presents an increasingly visible and expanding field of Indigenous creative practice. It centers individual practices while acknowledging shared histories to create a visual experience that foregrounds diverse approaches to concept, form, and medium, as well as connection, influence, conversation, and collaboration. An Indigenous present foregrounds transculturalism over affiliation and contemporaneity over outdated categories. For instance, Diné artist Raven Chacon received a Pulitzer Prize work for his work, A Voiceless Math. And if you read this, it considers the futility of giving voice to the voiceless when ceding space is never an option for those in power. So to conclude, to return to the original thesis of this talk, that languages need to be maintained in cultural context. In New Mexico, with its rich history, people have shown that even in the face of challenges such as reduced access to land and boarding school programs, other ways of making meaning to the relationship to the land. So our global challenge is immense, not just for the New Mexicans. It's estimated that structural failure of tailing dams and ensuing release of toxic metals in the environment is a great concern. The standard of public reporting on tailing dams incidents is poor. A large number remain completely unreported or lack basic facts when reported. There's no comprehensive database for historic failures. According to the mining engineer David Chambers of the Center for Science in Public Participation, 10,000 years is even a conservative estimate of how long most tailing dams will need to maintain structural integrity. So I contend that supporting language revitalization of different cultural complexes can move us forward in naming and claiming spaces to deter toxification practices. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you for your comment. I think from my perspective, it's a sort of a combination of the scientific tools that we have at our disposal. Um, but also the whole idea of land-based knowledge, I think, is very important. And I'm always sort of surprised that's still here. We're all sitting the whole week in this room. Whereas I'm like, how do we do embodied knowledge? So that is my biggest question. It's like, how do we do it? So I try to, do it with my students, but I think it's really undervalued of what that is. Go out, walk around, you see very different things. And for me, it was very nice to have these different kind of tools where suddenly my brain was sort of unhinged of my fossilized framework. I suddenly could see things differently and go out and do it.